This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and this is part 8 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle. Oh boy. I'll tell you right now before I dig into this. My wife and I are suffering from the ravages of the descendants of these satanic bankers. So this book is kind of hitting me personally right now. And my wife and I, it's not good. Not good at all. If I could just go back in time and redo a few things, huh? I realize more and more that, well, so many things, concatenations of things. Realize more and more that women were not supposed to be in positions of authority in the workplace, in stressful jobs in the workplace. They're not even supposed to be in the workplace. Let's call it what it is. But I see my wife. This is the second time since I've known her that I've seen this. She kind of, when she goes beyond a certain stress level, she snaps. I mean, she goes like into zombie mode. Well, it's kind of half zombie mode and half harpy mode, where, you know, she's the wife in Proverbs when the husband would be better off on the corner of a roof. Yeah. Hates my guts for everything. Every little thing. And the little things are ridiculously not so little to such a woman. But ultimately the resentment stems from not feeling safe, from me, in this case me, giving my wife the go-ahead to accept this position of authority in the workplace. And another thing I realize, and this concatenates, they're all linked. They all build on one another and turn into one revelation, turning into another. I realize more from seeing the drastic way that my wife shuts down when she's overloaded. See, I don't do that. I get depressed, but I mean, I'm not always depressed, but I'm always struggling with depression, that's true. It's always on the edge. But I mean, it really doesn't change me that much because I've struggled with depression my whole life. I don't have a radical shutdown, a radical personality change when I'm overloaded with stress. And though my wife would never realize this, she'd certainly never hear it from me. Honestly, the stress I've been through in my life is a lot more than what my wife's gone through. I mean, her parents are Ozzie and Harriet, and mine, don't even get me started. I mean, that's just for starters. I've had to move around and be unstable a lot more. I've been through a lot more, and I never shut down like this. So what that tells me, confirms for me, is that all that bullshit in pop culture psychology between genders about how women can handle stress better than men, and women can handle loneliness better than men, and women can do this better than men, on and on and on, it's all bullshit. It's bullshit. And it's propaganda that the oligarchs want to feed to middle-class and working-class men to keep them feeling emasculated and weak and impotent, to keep them down. And that's why they want you to read People magazine and all the trash, and watch the gender shows on the Discovery Channel where it's nothing but a hit piece against men. I see it again now because Men can handle stress better. Certainly in the workplace, men handle stress much better. Much better. My gosh. So, they don't call it God's Word for nothing. All of that warned me. But I didn't see a way out with my wages. I still don't. I mean, that's the irony. Regardless of how hard you work and how many people you got working, you still end up owing the bankers. It's weird how that happens. So getting back to the bankers, let's get back to them. This is Part 8 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. Potsherds and Other Fragments. The glimpse at these cataclysmic events of relatively modern times, as in the previous chapter, will assist towards understanding of the implications of similar events in ancient times of which but the most fragmentary information exists. As was written 3,000 years ago, quote, "Is there anything whereof it may be said, See, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us," unquote. Gee, I know where that comes from. I don't even have to look at the footnote. So returning to that smaller world of ancient days, the theme of this book, it may safely be said that similar conspiracy and secret maneuver led up to all that fast-changing sequence of social events that clearly followed a definite design in Attica, particularly from the collapse of hereditary kingship in 683 B.C., which date marks, it most reasonably may be assumed, the commencement of rule by money-creative power, either international or homegrown. A king created annually by vote has even less chance of ruling effectively than the so-called presidents of today. Elective kings as they really are, though sorry enough spectacles some of them may be, and who have as much as 5 years to serve the purposes of whoever they front for. There you go. The presidents are just facades they're fronting for the bankers. Some writers dismiss the idea of a capitalism in antiquity, but accepting definition of capitalism as the condition of the unrestricted promotion of human activity through the instrument of the driving force of that power of creation, and loan against collateral and at interest of the unit of exchange, or of promises of the unit of exchange as denoted by ledger credit page entry, and which function as the same thing in exchanges between persons dealing with the same banker or interlocked system of banks. Very little analysis of the circumstances that gave rise to the tyrants will show that a form of quote-unquote capitalism did exist, even if more local in character, and restricted to the individual city or state as a rule. The tyrant was a front man towards the total monetization of the state, the land and its labor, and towards the transfer of that independent labor, formerly firmly placed in the natural order of God life, to a condition of dependence on a wage of money. There you go. Directed towards being able to keep on living as with the notion of being a free man. Oh, I love this book. Today, we but repeat the mistakes of the past, and how. However, today, it is not merely disaster to a small city or state and its way of life, but with the existing refinement of that which can be only described as the money swindle as it was conducted in ancient times by the Trapezite at their bench in the marketplace, made possible by mass paper manufacture and the printing press, and the enormous potentialities therein towards quickening the speed and drive of human life and endeavor, it almost certainly will prove to be, one way or another, total disaster, and to all mankind. What a hell of a paragraph is that? Wow! Yeah, that's where it's leading. And what did Jesus say about the root of all evil? The love of money. And here David Astle is documenting and extrapolating it into prediction from the history that hasn't happened yet, that it's all going to lead to the total disaster, total destruction of mankind. The love of money. The donkey caravaneers morphed into the money changers, and then into what we have today. The Rockefellers and the Warren Buffetts and Warren Buffets and all of that. Those lines of Solon say enough. Quote, "But of themselves and their folly, the men of the city are willing, our great city to wreck, being won over by wealth. False are the hearts of the people's leaders." Unquote. A further couplet indicates the meaning of our great city to wreck. Quote, "Great men ruin a city for lack of understanding. Under a despot's yoke lieth the people enslaved." Unquote. These lines, written after the seizure by Pisistratus of the tyranny at Athens, would indicate that the same Pisistratus had the assistance in his rise to power of those former great landowning families of Attica who had been drawn into the schemes of the foreign money masters to their undoing. These landowners had forgotten their duty towards their own people, fascinated by strange luxuries and the stranger talk of the moneymen, the Trapezite. They had permitted themselves to be absorbed with visions of that new wealth, measured by the numbers indicated by the precious metal symbols of these same Trapezite. They forgot that in the absolute analysis, they themselves were but stewards of a higher power. Lacking understanding, above all, of the true nature of this money as being, above all, their own law, towards the facilitation of the exchanges amongst themselves and their people, they had been led astray from their duty. By conniving with the bankers and their protégés, the new manufacturers, to drive their own people off the land into the cities and into the industries, rapidly speeding up from the new money economy, they forgot that in their capacity as rulers, the whole land was theirs in trust to their people, and that the people, therefore, were expectant of them to be their guides and shepherds. These plausible aliens who set up the money economy via their so-called quote-unquote banks owned nothing but unmitigated gall, a vast contempt for mankind, and such as they could double-talk the naive peasant rulers into giving them. Well said. The folly of these rulers in equating possession with the master moneyers, trifling pieces of gold and silver, dated back to those grim kings of the Homeric sagas or before, who, being lain in their graves at Mycenae with all their riches, thus set off on their eternal journey with that small store of gold that the crafty Babylonian moneymen had trained them to regard as wealth, as opposed to the real wealth of an organized state, whose money was the benevolent law of the ruler in relation to surpluses, and directed towards the good and continuing life of the people, and no more. Those who had power and made men to marvel at their riches. This line indicates that Solon, like so many equally worthy people of this day, knew that money was an evil without understanding what it was about money that made it so. Not the halving of the precious metal pieces of the banker, recording the number of units represented, for such metal money lying inert beneath the floors has no meaning so far as the quickening or slowing of the pulse of life is concerned. It has no more meaning than have abstract units of exchange media that have not yet been recorded in the ledger on account of no suitable demand for them. Yes, suitable to the banker. And of course they are without limit, nor even the spending of it as the holder according to law might choose. The evil in the forgetfulness of the ruler, that money is no more than a recording of his law of exchange, its magnitude being governed by the number of units indicated. It can never be treasure which is merely items carrying with them a high valuation in relation to such units, relative to their desirability and portability. The evil about money derives in consequence from lack of understanding of its true nature, and particularly from the confusing of money and treasure. It is the persistent failure of mankind to realize that money is but the result of agreement being arrived at amongst a sovereign people through their ruler to provide themselves with a system of numbers by which their exchanges might be facilitated, and so help them to live a better life. Boy, did that get perverted. Treasure being but commodity, by which the unit of value of whatever state may be can best be stored, even though such states cease to exist, because of that ancient and international convention in respect to the valuation of such treasure, such as has lasted from age to age, from the most ancient times, Paleolithic or earlier, until today. The evil lay, and it may be said lies, in the forgetfulness of the ruler to respect his duty to provide an adequate money supply for his people, regulated by himself and free of obligation to external forces, in such manner as had existed in the ancient Oriental civilizations in earlier times. It lay in the permitting to private, and hence irresponsible persons, the power to intervene in that which was the most sacred responsibility of the ruler through the priesthood, the creation and regulation of the medium of exchange, i.e., his people's money. Therefore, the hidden force behind the setting up of a tyranny was the far-reaching power of a conspiratorial secret society, international in scope, controlling money emission in all countries, which it penetrated through its continuing control of the sources of supply of that silver treasure by weight, such as constituted the base of the exchange systems long ago established by itself. The tyrant, therefore, was clearly the front man for the local banker, more than actually being the banker himself. He it was who gave legality to the banker and the activities of that coterie of merchants, traders, and captains who flourished on the banker's financial organization. You're describing the American economy today. And, though this they did not understand, his connection with those international bullion brokers of the day. These worthy businessmen depended for tiding themselves over difficult periods on that which the banker loaned them as money. Maybe an entry in a ledger transferable to the account of a fellow merchant, visiting captain, or trader in slaves, or other merchandise. They also depended on the banker to be safe custodian for such treasure as came their way. The tyrant was, therefore, either naive or corrupt, the instrument set up by the banker, firstly, towards the legalization of his status, and secondly, towards the removal of that class, who might yet challenge his peculiar and secret power, the natural aristocracy of Hellas. This natural aristocracy, in a growing system that clearly sought the alienation and subversion of its free dependents, with the purpose of ultimately leading them into paid day labor or into slavery final and absolute, was uncertainly situated in states which now owed their existence to the bankers and their coterie of entrepreneurs and manufacturers and merchants, as clearly did so many of the Greek states of the Greek industrial revolution. The banker, lurking in the shade, apart from men, knew that these proud noblemen, formerly lords of this lovely land, which was Greece, had forgotten the meaning of their own existence and its relation to the total ordering of their society, and he despised them as well he might, for permitting him to undermine the true order of life and cause these simple folk, their peasantry, to be driven off the land one way or another. Same thing that happened to the American farmers. Amazing. Same thing that happened in the old world in Europe prior to that. Feudalism. To the wage slavery of the potteries at Corinth or Athens, or wherever it might be, or whatever it might be. In the same way, the lords of the manors of England and Scotland, here we go, had driven the peasantry off the common lands some 2,400 years later. Land now representing that magic of money, of which previously they had seen little. The same peasantry drifting into the new manufacturing and mining towns, dazed and leaderless, then formed a plentiful labor supply for that similar putrescent wickedness which was the Industrial Revolution in England's green and pleasant land. If they were lucky, they were able to emigrate. In the lines of Theognis, whose political aim was to prevent a recurrence of the tyranny in Megara, which was a center for the manufacture of textiles, quote, "Tradesmen reign supreme. The bad lord it over their betters." Well, that's America today. This is the lesson that all must thoroughly master. How that in the world wealth has the might and the power. Many a bad man is rich, and many a good man is needy. That's America today. Not without cause. O wealth, do men honor thee above all things? Must men reckon the only virtue the making of money? That's America today. Everyone honors those that are rich and despises the needy, unquote. America today, in England and all the other Western countries. Probably all the other countries. The banker, trained from the money shops of Babylonia, knew that for him the only desirable political situation was where the lowly and vulgar held the appearance of power and wealth and quote-unquote money, for such would not question too intently the source from whence they derived that quote-unquote money, nor the nature of that quote-unquote money, such as had paved their way to so-called power, for fear its so necessary supply might be cut off. In the words of Aristophanes, quote, "Often has it crossed my fancy that the city's apt to deal with the very best and noblest of the commonweal, just as with our ancient coinage and the fine new minted gold. These, sir, are sterling pieces, all of pure Athenian mold, all of perfect dye and metal, all the fairest of the fair, all of workmanship unequaled, proved and valued everywhere. These we used not, but the worthless pinchbeck coins of yesterday, vilest dye and basest metal, now we always use instead. Even so, our sterling townsmen, nobly born and nobly bred, men of worth and rank and metal, men of honorable fame, trained in every liberal science, choral dance and manly game, these we treat with scorn and insult, but the strangers newliest come, worthless sons of worthless fathers, pinchbeck townsmen, coppery scum, whom in earlier days the city hardly would have stooped to use, even for her scapegoat victims, these for every task we choose," unquote. Where, as in a city such as Megara, one banking house might control all credit or money creation, to question and seek to know how this was done would also mean search for knowledge of the banker's secrets, and this, our tyrant instinctively knew, was dangerous for his continued success. What are the gains that lead up to a tyranny? Is it not more probable that they are some form of payment received by the commons, those that are bad, from the would-be tyrant? Not at all. Merely the word was passed by the banking institution, to which the majority of tradesmen and manufacturers in that particular city were indebted, that the banker, giver of all and taker of all, favored this move. Ah, and indeed it would be good for all, and to please the common people there would be plenty of work. It may safely be considered that the first legislation passed by our new tyrant would legalize the position of his backers, which previously, as likely as not, had been illegal. The tyrant at this stage of history was a necessity to money power, and while possibly having the appearance of being wealthy, he depended for his real finances on that backer whose interests he promoted. Those two officers of Alexander, for example, who accepted the tyranny of Asiatic cities, could in no way have understood the reality of finance, international or otherwise, except perhaps if they had been clerks in the paymaster corps of officer status. If they had so understood such finance, it is doubtful that they would have been promoted as they were. The tyrant was one who the banker could rely on to put through his quote-unquote leveling program, or in the double talk of today, could be relied on to, quote, press ahead with democratization, unquote, and to work against the class from which he was supposed to have come. He was one who could be relied on to put through programs of public works, maintain military expenditures, etc. For all such activities strengthened the banker's position as creator and regulator of the exchange unit, and therefore, from those exclusive courtyards wherein he schemed, designer of the life of the city. The banker could not maintain his hold over the city, except his product, ledger, credit, page entry money, however created, was in constant demand, and the local government deeply embroiled in his schemes. The tyrant had to be one completely in accord with that so-called, quote-unquote, democratic political attitude, which the banker always seemed to espouse. His ostensible purpose had to be, quote-unquote, level. Such leveling meaning, of course, tearing down everything above themselves, and above the banker, too. Those fragments of verse, as quoted here, reputed to be by Solon, leave little doubt of the sincerity of Solon, at least superficially. The fact remains that, as a merchant, whether of necessity or otherwise, he must have been marked with some of the outlook of that class. His famous laws, amongst which was that law releasing the peasantry from the debt slavery into which their natural rulers had permitted them to be drawn, and that was eating into the very vitals of Attica, in view of the fact that he offered citizenship to any family moving to Athens with the intention of taking up some manual trade, might very well have been promoted by his backers. The city was clearly short of suitable free labor. It very well might be that his backers were those moneylenders and bankers that controlled the growing manufactories of Athens, and who saw that there was more profit and work for that which they loaned as money in bringing the peasantry to Athens as free men, if a wage slave is really any more free than a slave owned outright, mind you, and in having thus a plentiful supply of labor, then in tying such peasantry to the soil by debt slavery, and in the case of distraint, their sale on to a surfeit market abroad. while there was still a healthy population of small holders, as well as the great landlords, there was always a possibility of recovery by the enslaved state and themselves, the enslavers, as happened at Sparta in the time of Lycurgus, driven out of the land for hundreds of years, with a massive proletariat beholden to the men of the city for their freedom as day laborers. The former aristocracy, even if they should ever awaken to their duty, would have no chance. Nor did they. All those quote-unquote liberalizing laws promulgated by Solon and his successors steadily deprived the ancient families of Attica of their former power and prerogative. The shadow of power was put into the hands of ignoble persons, as indeed would have been so many of the quote-unquote demagogues and other quote-unquote democratic officials who, too often, would have been no more than blind creatures lifted up from the mob to the service of money power. By the devices existing as part of what is known as quote-unquote democracy, such as ostracism through rumor, put into circulation by the secret societies in the city, controlled, as in today, by the bankers without a doubt, quote-unquote leaders who were no longer quote-unquote suitable could be removed. Quote, the tyrants themselves are repeatedly found making it part of their policy to keep their subjects employed on big industrial concerns. In more than one case, we shall see their power collapsing just when this policy becomes financially impossible, unquote. In other words, if that tyrant proved unsatisfactory to his masters, money, that source of strength in political life, was cut off just at the time when it would be most needed, such as when he had become involved in heavy spending. Herein is further proof of the tyrant being not money power itself, but frontman for money power. Quote, this part of the tyrant's policy is noticed by Aristotle, who quotes the dedications, buildings and works of art, of the Cypselids at Corinth, and the buildings of Olympian Zeus at Athens by the Pisistratids, and the works of Polycrates around Samos. To these names we add Theogenes of Megara, Phalaris of Agrigentum, Aristodemus of Cumae, and the Tarquins of Rome, all of whom are associated with works of this kind, unquote. It is pointed out by Professor Ure that it can scarcely be an accident that the tyranny of Athens ended almost immediately after the removal of one of its two roots, i.e., the mines of the country of the Thracians and Paeonians. Which is to say that if the source of bullion on which the money power of a so-called banker was founded petered out or was lost to enemy action, the tyrant he had promoted could be discarded as having no further purpose. Such activities being ordered by a class of persons who had achieved despotic power in the same period of history, roughly the 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries B.C., the period which saw extensive development of mining in all of Europe, including Lydia, Cyprus, Spain, Carpathia, Epirus, Illyria, Thrace, and Greece itself, without mentioning the flow of precious metal plunder deriving from the depredations of the Assyrian, can only have been the result of a policy deep laid and far-reaching in its consequences. This policy can only have been created in some central point from which flowed the springs of world power, such as would have designed, wittingly or unwittingly, so much of the ancient world. The same period also coincided with the development of mining tools of hardened iron, highly efficient methods of reduction of silver-bearing ores, and the growth of an adequate supply of slave labor from various sources due to the above-mentioned depredations of the Assyrian, etc., all of which was so necessary towards profitable mining operations at that time. It may not unreasonably be supposed that this central point was still in the cities of lower Mesopotamia, such as Babylon, Lachish, Uruk, etc. From this area, the merchant houses would have continued to have spread their operations around the world in the same way as, it is recorded, had been done from as much as 1,500 years before, during the so-called Third Dynasty, or, for that matter, during the period of seeming glory and empire that so often follows the accession to power of private money creative force in any organized and potentially vigorous state. A most outstanding instance of the latter in modern times exists in the period of empire that came to Britain following the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 A.D. The silver which the international bankers drew from Greece, etc., at a ratio of 10 to 1 or more, would have been used in settlement of trade balances with India, Bactria, or China, at a ratio of 6 to 1 or less as to gold. According to Alexander Del Mar, this movement of silver to the Orient from Athens was arranged by the Athenian government. But except this early Athenian government was fronting for the bankers, this could not have been so. International trade balances have always been settled from the world's banking capital, or headquarters of the international bankers or bullion brokers, such as was London during the 3 centuries until very recently. In the days of which we write, this world banking capital was still located in Babylon City, it may be reasonably assumed. Okay, we're going to take a break, and we will see you in a couple of minutes with the finishing part to Part 8 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle. Okay, we're back, finishing up the second half of Part 8 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. The money of the cities of lower Mesopotamia, and the whole Near East for that matter, had been based for a long time on the international valuation of silver by weight, and therefore these cities had long ago sought to obtain control of all sources of supply of such silver. As far back as 2470 B.C., King Manishtusu of Akkad invaded southern Persia with no purpose other than gaining control of its silver mines. When the rapid expansion of mining, as mentioned above, brought on to the markets of the world a relative deluge of silver and gold, the latter taking no mean second place, those groups controlling international finance from Babylonia and possibly from Nineveh decided, no doubt, to seek for further worlds to conquer, as it were. The thing was to find a use for their surfeit of bullion, particularly silver, and of which metal they were now in a position to arrange extensive supplies to any banker who would be able to use such advantageously towards the promotion of their general worldwide plans. The growing commercial and industrial vigor of the Greeks showed them an answer to this problem. Thus, the significance of the advent of the tyrants as promoters of heavy public spending of monies, based originally on the silver standards of Babylonia, cannot be dismissed. The policy of the bankers for whom the tyrants fronted would be to spread the main practice, at least their most profitable one, of money creation from private sector one way or the other. Using silver as base, they knew full well the tremendous possibilities that existed towards the creation of an abstract money whose equally efficient units cost them no more than entry by the slave scribe on the clay tablet that sufficed as his ledger. Such policy spread, together with competition in manufacture, the need for that which the international bankers of that day, faceless as in this day, loaned against collateral as money. This money was based on the silver bullion they let it be known they were possessed of, or held on deposit for their customers, be they individual, corporate body, or state. It is reasonable to assume that there was little difference as between that first tangible money of private issuance in England, as denoted by the goldsmiths' receipts of the 16th and 17th centuries, and the money as issued by the banks of the Greek cities. Its efficacy in the exchanges, although it was in reality no more than a highly organized system of counterfeit, derived from the total secrecy maintained by those involved in its issue. Little clear information exists on this subject today, as in ancient times, and much of which, even if all the millions of tablets unearthed in Mesopotamia are ever translated and evaluated by scholars competent to do so, must remain as but faint outline. One such faint outline of particular interest, though not deriving from the Mesopotamian tablets, is discernible in this information of Servius Tullius, slave king of early Rome. Quote, according to Cherisius, Varro wrote, Numum Argenteum flatum primum a Servio Tullio dicant is fourth scripulus major fuit quam nunc. Translated, it is said that silver money was first made by Servius Tullius and was 4 scripulus heavier than now, unquote. As it was Servius Tullius who ordered the establishment of the census at Rome that gave the basis for both taxation and military service, both essential organizations as to a state being taken over by international money power, the truth of this statement by Varro need not be questioned. It is interesting to note in passing that although Servius Tullius was a usurper undoubtedly of slave origin, Livy, carefully draws him in rather more favorable light than the Tarquins, particularly Superbus, the last of the line. Superbus? Superbus? Okay. By the time of Livy, 59 BC to 17 AD, the most powerful sector of the Roman population, the equites or knights, was taken over by wealthy freedmen and enfranchised foreigners. Livy, when writing in that day under the threat of Lex Majestas, would clearly have seen the value of finding and extolling true virtue in the character of the slave king, whether such virtue was there or not. However, if Servius actually did exist, and there seems to be a school of thought amongst the scholars that questions his existence, then it would be more likely as one who had raised himself up in a similar manner to Gyges of Lydia, having at the same time a special backing by local money power, possibly in opposition to that money power emigrant from Corinth to Tarquinii in Etruria, which, according to Livy, was the Tarquin family. The establishment of a silver standard as a base for monetary issuance might very well have been their reward for their assistance towards raising Servius to the throne. The census, supposedly established by Servius, while being the foundation of the organization of the whole state for defense or aggression, would give that money power a complete picture of the people it was their intention, one way or another, to exploit. In the same manner, the doomsday books of the Middle Ages, while recording for the reference of the king all that in the kingdom was, also made valuable record for the money-creative power which had kings, nobles, ecclesiastics, and the common people groaning under a burden of debt quite impossible to meet, which certainly was one of the main causes of the mood of the English that gave rise to Magna Carta, and of those events which followed until 1290 A.D., when the tax-collecting and money-lending classes, such as had followed the quote-unquote conqueror across the English Channel, were finally evicted. In a similar manner, some 2,500 years later, William III of England, owing his throne to the intrigues of the international bullion brokers at Amsterdam, granted them as reward that which they wanted more than anything on earth, which was the establishment of the legality of an undeterminable amount of abstract money, ledger credit page entry, or paper notes to be based on their gold loans to the state, and the creation of a quote-unquote bank at London from which they might issue this money, known as credit, as loan against real collateral throughout the whole kingdom. This bank was to be given the appearance of a State Department. Sound familiar? Fed Reserve. In this case, such status was obtained by permitting it to be named the Bank of England. By permitting it to be named the Federal Reserve. It's not a bank, and it's not of England. And the Federal Reserve is not federal, and there's no reserve. Considering the above-known instance of reward to international monetary powers for their services, far-reaching in its consequences, and many other instances of which there is neither time nor place to write herewith, Conjecture in respect to the establishment of a silver standard at Rome by Servius may not be too far afield. That Romans later rejected this standard as a base for their money, and the calamity and loss of sovereignty it brought them also is clear, for there is no further reference to silver money until that period when Rome was drifting towards the all-out struggle with Carthage, the year of the establishment of the Board of Moneyers for the striking of bronze, silver, and gold money, 289 BC, thereby no doubt yielding to the importunities of the international bullion brokers, with the ensuing outbreak of war thus being made a certainty. One of the main purposes of those extensive public works which almost invariably followed the establishment of a tyranny would be towards the establishment of some kind of national debt, in which is, as was in that day too, most control and profit to those manipulating international finance. That there is no evidence of the existence of such state indebtedness in those days does not necessarily mean that such did not exist. Excavation or other methods, 2,500 years from now, would not reveal this indebtedness, for instance, in the case of England, so far as its relation to the Bank of England was concerned. For, unbelievable though it may seem, there is, quote, remarkable absence of official records, unquote, for the first 100 years of the bank's existence. In the time of the tyrants, failure to keep books or records would be even more of a certainty. Sure, they whitewashed the history. Of course there's not going to be records of their usury and exploitation of masses of people. They're going to hide all that. That makes sense. Valuable byproducts of their extensive public works programs would be, 1. The peasants would leave the land enticed by the money wages offered for work on these projects and the pleasures and excitement that could be bought in the city with such money wages. There, once the construction boom was over, they formed a leaderless, hungry, and easily embittered, quote-unquote, proletariat. Boy, does that sound familiar. 2. The same proletariat could be manipulated by the agents of money power as a mob towards such political purposes as such money power might desire, including, besides removal of the natural nobility, removal of the so-called tyrant when his purpose was served. Man, think how much easier it must be for these money powers to manipulate the American thug brown shirts, the American SA troops that are forming under Alex Jones and John Stadtmiller et al. Professor Ure, author of The Origins of Tyranny, ventures as close to the truth in respect to the meaning of a tyranny as any others who have written on the subject, although attributing the rise of the tyrants to money power, he does not define what this money power may be, whether money creative power or just those of considerable possession and treasure. In this omission, he cannot be blamed. Professor Ure, for instance, traces the source of the power of Peisistratus, tyrant of Athens, 561 to 527 BC, according to Herodotus, as being partly from those silver mines in the district in Thrace through which flows the Strymon River, and partly from the Laurian mines in Attica. However, it must be pointed out that a man who apparently was a mining man and lived, therefore, within that restriction would be unlikely to understand the finer shades of monetary emission. It seems quite reasonable to suppose that the class of persons hidden within the Aramaic-speaking middle classes that permeated the whole Levant and Near East during the first millennium BC, and whose business was money and all that stemmed therefrom, in that they were interfering with that which clearly was a power to be exercised only by the very gods themselves, were scarcely likely to instruct their instrument, Peisistratus, therein. Therefore, it may be concluded, the tyrant rose because he was the one who had found favor with the all-pervading money power of the day. He was not money power itself. In that most of the great public works of the Greek cities had been carried forward by the tyrants is the evidence. For as the secretive money power of today, worldwide in scope, thrives primarily upon government loans directed to purposes of war, and the enormous spending that wars involve in order to strengthen their outrageous claims against the nations. In ancient days, similar heavy spending had to be devised. In that day, as previously pointed out, a great acropolis or some other such magnificent public work, with whose construction and financial organization money power was fully conversant, sufficed equally well with war, which, all said and done, with hardy aggressive peoples, could also prove considerably dangerous to themselves or their purposes. So, with the tyrant, we see the force by which Greece, previously living in natural order, was molded to an instrument more suitable to those bankers, private money creative power, who, lurking in the shade as needs they had to, burned with rancor at the natural rulers who but treated them as stewards, although the essence of power, for all that, lay in their hands for more than such rulers understood. Thus were the simple and industrious and brave Greeks now raised up to be the new vehicle through which the final and destructive purposes of those controlling international bullion and slave trades would be achieved. You could replace Greeks with Americans in that sentence. The simple and industrious and brave Americans were raised up to be the vehicle, were to be the policemen around the world for the international bankers and their destructive purposes, and their slave trades and drug trades, etc., armament trades, as they shepherd the peoples of the world further down that road of no hope for themselves or the rest of mankind. My Lord, the love of money truly, truly, truly is the root of all evil and all wars. As religion is not the cause of wars. Money is the cause of wars. Ah, boy. I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth, and we've just covered Part 8 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. You won't find this one at your local Borders bookstore.